Hello, everybody. I just wanted to take a quick minute here and record a little follow-up video based on some of the common issues that came up in reading through the Konkin essays. Now, most of you did very well and did just fine, but one thing that came up on a good number of them was some confusion about what natural law really is. There still seems to be a little misunderstanding, at least in some cases. So I wanted to talk about that just here for a couple of minutes to clarify some of the issues. A lot of people in their essays were critical of the use of herbicides or pesticides or different chemicals, also critical of some of the hybridization and genetic engineering that has gone on with livestock and different crops in recent years. And of course, there are lots of legitimate questions and criticisms about some of those different practices in modern agriculture. But on a number of papers, I had to write something to the effect of, well, it's not necessarily wrong to do these sorts of things from a natural law perspective. Or I would need to mark something to say when a student said, oh, well, natural law says we can't change corn, or when natural law says we can't use a chemical weed killer, I had to say something like, well, that's not necessarily the case. So there seemed to be some misunderstanding there, right? So one thing to just make sure we're clear on, right, is that natural law doesn't mean that we just follow the law of nature, right? That is the way the natural world works without any sort of human interaction or involvement. It also doesn't mean that human beings can't manipulate nature or use things in nature. Or make use even of animals or plants, which some of the essays seem to indicate was contrary to natural law. The natural law understanding is that we can, in fact, make use of the created world around us. Now, we ought to do that in a way that fits with the nature of us and the created world. And so sometimes using chemicals or sometimes manipulating animals is going to be a bad thing from a natural law perspective, but not always. Now, one of the things I think that is maybe getting confused in people's minds is, right, in natural law, you can never intentionally harm an innocent person, right? So when we look at people, we look at, well, what leads to the flourishing of a person, right? And how do we act in accord with the nature of a person, right? So for example, it would be wrong to genetically manipulate human beings to make them bigger or grow faster or something like that, right? That would be immoral because, according to natural law, human beings have this intrinsic value that is unique to them, right? But the same is not necessarily true, say, of a chicken, right? There's nothing intrinsically contrary to natural law in breeding chickens to be larger, to grow faster, which human beings have done for centuries and millennia even, or maybe even genetically modifying chickens to have certain attributes that would be helpful for us. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean it's okay to treat chickens however we want either, right? That they do have a value, that they do have a nature that Christians would believe is given to them by God that we ought to respect, right? We ought to act in a way that is going to cause animals the least amount of suffering. We ought to act in a way that is going to allow the natural world to flourish as much as possible. But as we've talked about in natural law, sometimes some of our actions are going to have both good and bad effects, right? So, for example, if I'm hungry and I have a flock of nice plump chickens, according to natural law, I can act in a way that is going to have a bad effect for the chicken, namely, its life will end, it will die, and a good effect for me and my family that we will eat the chicken. Um, and we can go through kind of the principle of double effect there and reach the conclusion that it is morally okay to eat this chicken, right? The same thing could be true for, say, using a fertilizer, right? Let's say using this fertilizer on a particular field is going to provide necessary food for a large community. It may well have some relatively minor consequences for fish in a nearby stream, and we could go through principle of double effect and still conclude that it could in fact be moral to use this fertilizer. Now, of course, there's going to be in a lot of cases a lot of debate about how the good and bad effects balance, whether or not the good effect is greater than the bad effect, and natural law allows for those kinds of debates. But it's important to recognize that natural law doesn't forbid the manipulation of the natural world just in a blanket condemnation of that, right? You can, in fact, make use of plants and animals. You can, in fact, alter the natural world. You can, in fact, do things that you know will cause some sort of negative consequences for the natural world, the plants, the animals around you. Obviously, you should minimize that as much as you can. Obviously, you should try to promote the good of people and creation as much as possible, but there will be times when there is a certain trade-off, right? And so what we would do then is say, well, yes, we need to use this fertilizer to be able to feed the poor in our community. But what we will continue to do is to work for ways that will minimize the negative impact on the environment while still providing food for the poor, right? And there also might very well be situations where we should decide we shouldn't use this fertilizer because we are harming the environment, and the use of the fertilizer is not feeding the poor. It is, in fact, just providing a higher profit margin for a company that's already doing all right. Or it's just providing excess food that is going into kind of frivolous junk food for people. And so the good of junk food is not sufficient to compensate for the damage to the environment. And so we could conclude using principle of double effect reasoning that we ought not to use the fertilizer. So it's going to really depend on your intentions. It's going to depend on the balance of good and bad effects. But I just wanted to make sure we were clear on that because that's going to be important as we move forward, right? We're going to talk about the treatment of animals, impact on the environment from different things, and we need to make sure that we understand that natural law doesn't mean we can never modify the natural world or the way it works. We can do that. We just need to do it in a way where we are really aiming for the true good of people, and then also, as much as possible, the good of the natural world and creation as well. So as always, please let me know if you have any questions about that. I'd be happy to discuss it further on Blackboard, or certainly you can always email to arrange an office hour meeting or a phone discussion if that would be helpful as well. Thanks.